Imagine standing in a ditch so deep you can't see over the edge. The walls are made of mud, sandbags, and rotting wood. The ground beneath your feet is a thick soup of water, blood, and things you don't want to think about. Above you, the sky screams. Artillery shells tear through the air with a sound that makes your bones vibrate. Machine gun fire chatters in the distance, a rhythmic promise of death. You haven't slept in 3 days. You can't remember what dry socks feel like. The man next to you is shaking so badly his teeth are chattering, and he's not cold. He's terrified. You all are. And yet, when the whistle blows, you'll climb out of this trench and run toward the enemy through a hellscape of barbed wire, craters, and poison gas. Most of you won't make it 50 yards. This was trench warfare, and it changed everything about how human beings kill each other. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why modern soldiers don't line up in neat rows and march toward each other anymore? Why we use drones, bunkers, and strategic positions instead of charging across open fields? The answer lies in the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of World War I. This wasn't just a new way to fight. It was a fundamental transformation in the nature of warfare itself. A transformation so complete, so devastating, that military strategists are still studying it over a century later. And the stories from those trenches, the ones that never made it into your history textbook, are more horrifying and more human than you can possibly imagine. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand trench warfare, you need to understand what came before it. For centuries, warfare was almost gentlemanly by comparison. I'm not saying it was pleasant. War has never been pleasant, but there were rules, patterns, predictability. Armies would meet on battlefields, line up in formation, and engage in what military historians call open warfare. Cavalry charges, infantry lines, artillery positioned on hills. Commanders could see the entire battlefield from a vantage point. Battles were decisive. They had clear winners and losers. When Napoleon marched across Europe, when the British fought in the Crimea, when American forces clashed during the Civil War, battles were relatively short, brutal affairs that ended with one side retreating or surrendering. But by the early 20th century, something had changed. Technology had evolved faster than military thinking. Industrialization had given armies weapons that previous generations couldn't have imagined. The machine gun, invented in the late 1800s, could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. One man with a machine gun could do the work of 100 riflemen. Artillery had become more accurate, more powerful, more devastating. Shells could be lobbed miles away with precision that would have seemed like magic to Wellington or Grant. Railroads meant armies could move faster and supply lines could stretch further. Chemical engineering had created explosives that were more deadly than anything in human history. And yet, military commanders were still thinking like it was 1815. They still believed in the cavalry charge, the infantry advance, the concept of élan, that mythical French idea that courage and aggressive spirit could overcome any obstacle. They were wrong, catastrophically, tragically wrong, and millions of young men would pay the price for their miscalculation. When World War I began in August 1914, everyone expected it to be over by Christmas. The German Schlieffen Plan called for a rapid sweep through Belgium and into France, encircling Paris and forcing a quick surrender. The French Plan 17 called for aggressive offensives to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine. Both sides were supremely confident. Both sides wore brightly colored uniforms. French soldiers marched toward the enemy in blue coats and red pants. Red pants, can you imagine? They might as well have painted targets on their chests. The British wore khaki, which was slightly more sensible, but still believed that disciplined rifle fire and bayonet charges would carry the day. The early weeks of the war were mobile, fast-paced, and absolutely devastating. The Battle of the Frontiers in August 1914 saw the French suffer over 300,000 casualties in just 2 weeks. 300,000. That's more casualties than the United States suffered in the entire Vietnam War, compressed into 14 days. The German advance seemed unstoppable. They pushed through Belgium, committed atrocities that shocked the world, and drove deep into France. The French government evacuated Paris. It looked like the war really would be over by Christmas. But then something unexpected happened. The French and British forces regrouped and counterattacked at the Battle of the Marne in September 1914. The German advance stalled. Both sides tried to outflank each other in what became known as the Race to the Sea. They pushed north, trying to get around the enemy's western flank, establishing positions, fortifying them, pushing further north, fortifying again. By November, the line stretched from the Swiss border to the English Channel. 440 miles of front, and neither side could get around the other. There was nowhere left to go. The war of movement was over. The war of attrition had begun, and this is where the trenches came in. At first, they were just temporary positions. Soldiers dug shallow ditches to protect themselves from artillery and machine gun fire while they figured out their next move. But the next move never came. Those temporary ditches became deeper, more elaborate, more permanent. What started as simple holes in the ground evolved into vast underground cities stretching across Western Europe. And once both sides were entrenched, once they had machine guns positioned to cover every approach, once the artillery was registered on every possible attack route, getting out of those trenches became almost impossible. Let me paint you a picture of what these trenches actually looked like, because the popular image doesn't do them justice. People think of trenches as simple ditches, like the ones you might dig in your backyard. The reality was far more complex. The trench systems were masterpieces of engineering, born from necessity and refined through years of brutal trial and error. A typical trench system had 3 main lines. The front line, where soldiers faced the enemy directly. The support line, a few hundred yards back, which provided reinforcement and supplies. And the reserve line even further back, where troops could rest and regroup. These weren't straight lines. That would be suicidal. A single artillery shell landing in a straight trench could kill dozens of men, and an enemy who broke through could shoot down the entire length. Instead, trenches were built in a zigzag pattern with sharp turns every few yards. Each straight section, called a traverse, was only about 10 or 15 feet long before the trench turned sharply. This meant an explosion or an enemy breakthrough would only affect a small section. The trenches themselves were about 7 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The front wall, facing the enemy, was called the parapet. It was built up with sandbags, packed earth, and anything else that could stop a bullet. The back wall was called the parados, and it protected soldiers from shells that overshot the trench. At the bottom of the trench, duckboards, wooden slats, created a walkway above the water and mud that perpetually filled the trenches. Along the front wall, a fire step, a ledge about 2 feet high, allowed soldiers to stand up and shoot over the parapet. But this is just the basic structure. The real complexity was in everything else: communication trenches, narrow passages that zigzagged back from the front line to the support and reserve lines, allowing soldiers and supplies to move without being exposed to enemy fire. Saps, short trenches that jutted out into no man's land toward the enemy position, used for listening posts and forward observation. Dugouts, underground chambers carved into the trench walls, some shallow and simple, others deep and elaborate with multiple rooms, ventilation systems, and electric lights powered by generators. The German trenches were particularly impressive. They had more time to dig in during the war's early months, and German military doctrine emphasized strong defensive positions. Some German dugouts went down 30 or 40 feet, deep enough to survive all but the heaviest bombardment. They had concrete reinforcement, bunk beds, medical stations, command centers. When British soldiers finally captured German trenches during offensives, they were astonished at the quality. Meanwhile, British and French trenches were often less elaborate, partially because Allied commanders kept insisting the trenches were temporary, that offensive operations would break through any day now. That day never came. Living in these trenches was a special kind of hell. Not the dramatic hell of battle, though that was terrible enough, but the grinding daily hell of simply existing in these conditions. Let's start with the water. Trenches were below ground level, which meant they collected water. Rain, groundwater, snowmelt, it all flowed into the trenches. In some sectors, especially in Flanders where the water table was high, trenches were constantly flooded. Pumps ran day and night, but they couldn't keep up. Soldiers stood in water that was knee-deep, waist-deep, sometimes chest-deep. This wasn't clean water. This was a fetid mixture of rain, mud, urine, and decomposing bodies. Because here's the thing about no man's land. The strip of ground between the opposing trenches, it was filled with corpses. Thousands upon thousands of corpses, bodies from failed attacks, soldiers who had been killed and couldn't be recovered. They lay there, decomposing, until artillery fire dismembered them and scattered their remains across the battlefield. And when it rained, the runoff from this charnel ground flowed into the trenches. The smell was indescribable. Soldiers who survived the war said they could never forget it. The smell of death, decay, human waste, unwashed bodies, poison gas residue, and the sickly sweet smell of gangrene. It soaked into everything. Your clothes, your hair, your skin. You couldn't escape it. Some men claimed they could smell a sector before they could see it, that each part of the front line had its own distinctive odor of death. Then there were the rats. Oh God, the rats. They thrived in the trenches, feeding on the corpses and the soldiers' rations. They grew enormous, as big as cats, bloated and fearless. They would crawl over sleeping men, steal food from packs, and bite wounded soldiers who were too weak to fight them off. One soldier described waking up to find a rat eating the bread he'd placed next to his head. Another told of a rat emerging from a corpse's mouth, having burrowed inside to feed. You couldn't kill them all. For every one you shot or bayoneted, 10 more appeared. They were a constant, disgusting presence, and the lice. Every soldier had lice. It didn't matter how clean you tried to be, how often you changed your clothes, you had lice. They lived in the seams of your uniform, thousands of them, breeding in the warmth of your body. They bit constantly, causing a maddening itch that never stopped. Soldiers would spend their rest periods delousing, running candle flames along the seams of their uniforms to kill the eggs, but it was futile. Within hours, you'd be crawling with lice again. Some men scratched so much they created open wounds that became infected. The lice also carried disease, particularly trench fever, a debilitating illness that caused high fever, pain, and exhaustion. Trench foot was another constant threat. When your feet are wet and cold for days on end, the flesh begins to die. It starts with numbness, then pain, then your feet swell up and turn purple. The smell of rotting flesh emanates from your boots. If caught early, you might recover. If not, amputation was the only option. Thousands of soldiers lost toes, feet, or entire legs to trench foot. The British eventually implemented strict foot inspection regimes, requiring soldiers to dry their feet and change their socks regularly. But in the early years of the war, it was epidemic. But the physical conditions, as horrific as they weren't even the worst part. It was the psychological torture, the constant fear, the waiting. Human beings aren't built to live under constant threat of death. Our nervous systems are designed for short bursts of danger followed by safety, fight or flight. But in the trenches, there was no flight. You couldn't run. You were trapped in this ditch, and death could come at any moment from any direction. Artillery was the biggest killer. Not the dramatic infantry charges you see in movies, but artillery. 70% of casualties in World War I were caused by artillery fire. Shells fell randomly, without warning, turning men into red mist or burying them alive when trenches collapsed. You might be sitting there, writing a letter home, and suddenly your best friend's head is gone and you're covered in his blood and brain matter. Or you might be sleeping in a dugout when a shell penetrates and explodes, killing everyone instantly. Or perhaps worst of all, a shell might bury you alive, trapping you in the earth while you slowly suffocate, screaming for help that will never come because no one can hear you. And even if they could, digging you out might cause the entire trench to collapse. The psychological term for what these men experienced didn't exist yet. Shell shock, they called it, though we now know it as post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who had been brave, steady soldiers would suddenly break down, unable to speak, unable to move, shaking uncontrollably. Some went catatonic, some became violent, some simply wandered away from the trenches, walking in a daze toward enemy lines where they were shot down. Military authorities initially treated shell shock as cowardice. Men were court-martialed, imprisoned, even executed for it. Only gradually did doctors realize this was a medical condition, that the human mind can only endure so much before it shatters. And then there was the boredom. This sounds insane given everything I've just described, but soldiers talked about it constantly in their letters and diaries. The mind-numbing, soul-crushing boredom of trench life. Most of the time, nothing was happening. You weren't fighting, you were just sitting there in the mud, waiting. Soldiers would spend weeks in the trenches with only a few minutes of actual combat. The routine was deadening. Stand to at dawn, the most likely time for an enemy attack. Everyone on the fire step with weapons ready, staring into no man's land as the sun came up. Then stand down, breakfast if there was any, inspection, cleaning weapons, repairing trenches, cleaning weapons again, lunch, more maintenance, dinner, stand to at dusk, then the night routine. Some men would be sent out into no man's land on patrol or to repair barbed wire. Others would stand sentry, staring into the darkness, trying not to fall asleep because sleeping on sentry duty was a court-martial offense. Days blurred together. Weeks, months. Men lost track of time. The war became their entire world. It was hard to remember or imagine any other kind of life. Some soldiers served at the front for years, with only brief rest periods behind the lines. They saw friends killed, replaced by strangers, who became friends, who were killed and replaced again. The turnover was constant. Units lost their entire original rosters and then some. A battalion that started the war with 1,000 men might have 5,000 names on its casualty list by war's end. The same positions filled and refilled as men were fed into the meat grinder. Now let's talk about no man's land itself, because this was the space that defined trench warfare. The strip of ground between the opposing trenches, varying from 50 yards to half a mile wide. This was the most dangerous place on Earth. Nothing could survive there. It was a moonscape, cratered by artillery, strung with barbed wire, littered with bodies and the debris of war, shattered equipment, unexploded shells, the remnants of failed attacks. At night it came alive with activity. Patrols from both sides would crawl through the wire, trying to gather intelligence, capture prisoners, or simply prove they were brave enough to go out there. Soldiers moved on their bellies, inch by inch, terrified that a flare would go up and illuminate them, making them targets for machine guns. The barbed wire in no man's land wasn't like the wire on a farm fence. This was industrial barbed wire, thick as a man's thumb, strung in rows 10 or 20 feet deep. Some of it was coiled, concertina wire that would snag on your uniform and slice through fabric and flesh. Walking through it was impossible. You had to cut it, slowly, quietly, hoping the enemy didn't hear the distinctive sound of wire cutters. During an attack, artillery was supposed to cut the wire, but often it didn't. The shells would just churn up the ground and tangle the wire even worse. Attacking soldiers would reach the wire, find it intact, and be trapped there. Perfect targets for machine gunners who had been waiting for exactly this moment. And this brings us to the attacks themselves, the over-the-top charges that have become the defining image of World War I. Let me be clear about something. These attacks were not brave. I mean, the men who participated were incredibly brave, but the attacks themselves were not acts of courage. They were acts of murder, carried out by generals who were safely miles behind the lines, sending men to die in attacks they knew had little chance of success. Here's how it worked. First, an artillery bombardment. This could last hours, days, even weeks. The idea was to destroy enemy trenches, cut the barbed wire, and kill as many defenders as possible. Thousands of guns would fire simultaneously, hurling millions of shells at enemy positions. The noise was apocalyptic. Men miles away from the bombardment said the ground shook continuously, that you couldn't hear yourself think, that the sound drove some men mad. And at the receiving end, imagine being in a trench during a bombardment. Shells exploding all around you, the earth heaving, dugouts collapsing, men screaming, the air filled with dust and smoke and poison gas. You can't see, you can't breathe, you don't know if the next shell will land directly on you. Some bombardments killed thousands, others through sheer luck or deep dugouts killed relatively few, but they all terrified the survivors. Then the bombardment would stop. In that sudden silence, soldiers on both sides knew what was coming. The defenders would scramble out of their dugouts, race to the fire step, set up their machine guns, and wait. The attackers would fix bayonets, check their equipment, and prepare to climb over the parapet. Officers would synchronize their watches. Soldiers would shake hands, knowing many of them were about to die. Some would pray, some would joke, gallows humor being the only way to cope. Some would just stare ahead, faces blank, already resigned to death. Then the whistle would blow, and they would go over the top. Climbing out of a trench while weighed down with equipment, often while wounded or exhausted, was harder than it sounds. Some men had ladders, others had to scramble up, grabbing at sandbags and clawing at the dirt. Once out, they were supposed to form lines and advance toward the enemy. Doctrine called for them to walk, not run, maintaining formation so the attack would be coordinated. Walk. Through machine gun fire and artillery. This wasn't strategy. This was mass execution. The machine guns would open up. The sound was distinctive, a rapid hammering that meant death was sweeping across no man's land. Men would fall in rows, dozens at a time, cut down before they'd gone 10 yards. Others would make it further, scrambling through shell holes, trying to use craters for cover. Some would reach the barbed wire only to find it uncut, and while they struggled with it or tried to find gaps, machine gunners would pick them off methodically. A few, through luck or determination, might actually reach the enemy trench, Then came close quarters combat, grenades thrown into dugouts, men fighting with bayonets, clubs, knives, fists. Brutal, savage, personal killing. But even if they captured the first trench line, then what? They were isolated, often without communication to their own lines. Enemy reinforcements would counterattack. Artillery would start falling from both sides because neither side could tell where the front line was anymore. Wounded men would be left behind, lying in no man's land, crying for help. Some died quickly from their wounds. Others lingered for hours, days, calling for water, for their mothers, for someone to end their suffering. Both sides had standing orders not to help wounded men in no man's land during daylight. It was too dangerous. So they suffered and died within sight of their comrades who could do nothing. The numbers were staggering. During the Battle of the Somme, which began on July 1st, 1916, the British suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day. 60,000, 20,000 dead in one day. In some sectors, entire battalions were wiped out in minutes. The Newfoundland Regiment went over the top at Beaumont Hamel with 800 men. Within 30 minutes, only 68 were able to answer roll call. Entire villages in Britain lost all their young men on that single day because British units were organised regionally. The PALS battalions, they were called. Groups of men from the same town who had enlisted together. They died together too, and the truly insane thing? The attacks continued, day after day, week after week. The Somme offensive lasted 4.5 months. British and French forces gained about 6 miles of ground, 6 miles, at the cost of over 1 million casualties on both sides. 1 million people killed or wounded to move the front line 6 miles. And both sides called it a success because, by the demented logic of trench warfare, you measured success not in territory gained, but in enemy casualties inflicted. Attrition, killing more of them than they killed of you, bleeding the enemy white. These were the terms generals used, as if men were just numbers on a ledger. Verdun was even worse in some ways. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, deliberately chose Verdun, not because it was strategically important, but because he believed the French would defend it, no matter the cost, for symbolic reasons. His goal was to, and this is a quote, bleed France white. The battle lasted 10 months, 300 days of continuous combat, 700,000 casualties, for no gain. None. The front lines at the end were almost exactly where they'd been at the beginning. But an entire generation of French and German men were dead or maimed. The weapons used in these battles were increasingly horrific. Poison gas, first used by the Germans at Ypres in 1915, was meant to break the stalemate. Chlorine gas, phosgene, mustard gas, these chemicals would drift across no man's land in clouds, sinking into trenches, burning lungs, blinding eyes, blistering skin. Men would choke to death, drowning in their own fluids. Gas masks offered some protection, but early versions were primitive and uncomfortable. Soldiers had to carry them constantly and put them on within seconds of a gas alarm. If you were eating, sleeping, or wounded and couldn't get your mask on in time, you were dead or permanently injured. Flamethrowers were introduced, terrifying weapons that shot streams of burning fuel. Imagine seeing a man engulfed in flames, screaming as he burns alive. Both sides used them. Both sides feared them more than almost any other weapon. Tank crews that used flamethrowers knew they wouldn't be taken prisoner if captured. Enemy soldiers hated flamethrower operators so much they would kill them immediately, often brutally. Speaking of tanks, they first appeared at the Somme in September 1916. These early tanks were slow, unreliable, and vulnerable, but they could cross trenches and crush barbed wire. and most importantly, they were immune to machine gun fire. They terrified the Germans at first. Men ran from them or surrendered, but they broke down constantly, got stuck in shell holes, and were vulnerable to artillery. It would take another 2 years before tanks became truly effective. The adaptation and evolution of trench warfare tactics showed both the ingenuity and desperation of military minds trying to break the deadlock. By 1917, both sides had learned painful lessons written in the blood of millions. They developed new tactics, new strategies, new ways of trying to overcome the fundamental problem of trench warfare. That defense was almost impossible to defeat. Stormtrooper tactics, developed by the Germans, represented one of the most significant innovations. Instead of sending waves of men across no man's land to be cut down, the Germans trained elite units called Stoßtruppen to infiltrate enemy lines. These stormtroopers would move in small groups, avoiding strong points, bypassing resistance, penetrating deep into enemy territory to attack headquarters, artillery positions, and supply lines. They carried lighter weapons, grenades, flamethrowers, and were trained to move fast and strike hard. When Germany launched its spring offensive in 1918, these tactics initially proved devastatingly effective, punching through Allied lines and gaining more ground in days than previous offensives had gained in months. But even these innovations couldn't overcome the fundamental mathematics of trench warfare. Defenders could reinforce faster than attackers could advance. Railways moved troops to threatened sectors in hours. Attackers had to march across devastated ground, dragging their supplies and artillery with them. Every mile they advanced stretched their supply lines and brought them further from their own artillery support, while simultaneously bringing them closer to enemy reserves and fortified positions. This created what military historians call the tyranny of the tactical defensive. Even successful attacks would eventually stall, and the whole bloody process would start over. The psychological impact of this futility cannot be overstated. Soldiers understood the mathematics, even if their generals pretended not to. They knew that attacks rarely succeeded, that they were being ordered to die for yards of muddy ground that would probably be lost again in the next counterattack. This knowledge created a strange, fatalistic culture in the trenches. Dark humor became a survival mechanism. Songs mocking the war, the generals, and their own situation became popular. Soldiers would joke about death, about the incompetence of their officers, about the absurdity of their situation. It was laugh or go mad, and yet alongside this cynicism, there was also remarkable courage and camaraderie. Men formed bonds in the trenches that were stronger than almost any other human relationship. They depended on each other absolutely. Your trenchmate might save your life, pull you to safety when you're wounded, share his last cigarette or piece of chocolate, cover for you when you're too exhausted to stand watch. These friendships were intense, immediate, and often tragically brief. Survivors would talk about these bonds for the rest of their lives. How no other relationship ever quite measured up to the intensity of friendship forged under fire. There were also moments of humanity that seem almost impossible given the circumstances. The Christmas truce of 1914 is famous, when British and German soldiers in some sectors spontaneously stopped fighting, climbed out of their trenches, met in no man's land, exchanged gifts, played football, and buried their dead together. Officers on both sides were horrified and quickly banned any repetition, but smaller, unofficial truces happened throughout the war. Live and let live systems, where both sides would tacitly agree not to shoot during certain times, like meal times, or when soldiers were collecting water, artillery would deliberately miss. Snipers would aim high. These weren't acts of cowardice but of mutual survival. Why kill men who are doing the same miserable job you are when you don't have to? Of course, these truces were fragile and often broken. A new officer, eager to prove himself, might order a raid, shattering the unspoken agreement and reigniting vicious combat. High command hated these truces because they reduced the killing efficiency of their troops, so they would rotate units frequently, preventing soldiers from developing relationships with the enemy across no man's land. The role of snipers in trench warfare deserves special attention because they had a psychological impact far beyond their actual casualty numbers. A good sniper could make an entire section of trench uninhabitable. Any soldier who showed himself even for a moment risked having his head blown off. This created intense paranoia. Men would die because they stood up at the wrong moment, looked over the parapet for too long, or exposed themselves while moving. Snipers became bogeymen, invisible killers who could strike at any time. Both sides developed counter-sniper tactics, including sniper duels that could last for days as two expert marksmen tried to outwit each other. The British and Germans were particularly good at sniping, but the Canadians and Australians developed fearsome reputations. These colonial troops, many of whom had been hunters back home, brought rural skills to the trenches that made them exceptionally effective. They also brought a different attitude. They were less bound by British military formality, more willing to improvise and take initiative. Canadian and Australian units became known as shock troops, used for difficult assaults because they had proven themselves ferocious fighters. But let's talk about what happened when attacks actually succeeded and troops captured enemy trenches. The fighting that occurred in these close quarters was the most brutal and personal combat imaginable. Grenades, called Mills bombs by the British and potato mashers by the Germans, became primary weapons. You'd pull the pin, count to 3, and throw it around a corner or into a dugout. The explosion in confined spaces was devastating. Shrapnel tearing through flesh, concussion rupturing organs. Soldiers who survived grenade attacks in trenches often suffered permanent hearing loss or traumatic brain injuries. When grenades ran out, men fought with whatever they had. Bayonets, yes, but also clubs studded with nails, sharpened entrenching tools, knives, even fists and boots. This wasn't the heroic combat of movies. It was desperate, savage, primal. Men would grapple in the mud, trying to kill each other with anything available. The fighting was so intense, so confusing, that sometimes men couldn't tell friend from enemy in the chaos. Friendly fire incidents were common. Units would become mixed up, lost in the maze of trenches, accidentally firing on their own men. Clearing dugouts was particularly terrifying. You'd stand at the entrance to an underground chamber, knowing there might be enemy soldiers inside, and you'd have to go in. Sometimes you'd throw grenades down first, but often you just had to descend into the darkness with your weapon ready. The confined space meant if someone was waiting, you were probably dead. Many soldiers refused to enter dugouts and would instead seal them up, burying whoever was inside alive. This was considered more merciful than the alternative because soldiers trapped in sealed dugouts would eventually run out of air and lose consciousness before dying. Quick, relatively painless, better than being burned alive by a flamethrower or torn apart by grenades. The logistics of trench warfare were a nightmare that often doesn't get enough attention. Keeping hundreds of thousands of men supplied in trenches required an unprecedented organizational effort. Food, ammunition, water, medical supplies, building materials, mail from home, everything had to be brought forward from railheads miles behind the lines. This supply chain moved through communication trenches or, when those were impassable, across open ground at night. Soldiers serving as stretcher bearers, ration carriers, and ammunition runners faced constant danger, but rarely received recognition because they weren't combat troops. Food in the trenches was generally terrible. British soldiers subsisted largely on bully beef, canned corned beef that was barely edible, hard biscuits that could break teeth, and plum and apple jam. They received tea, which they brewed constantly because it was hot and helped with morale. The Germans had it somewhat better in the early years with access to decent bread and sausages, but by 1917, the British naval blockade had caused widespread shortages, and German soldiers were often genuinely hungry. French soldiers probably had the best food, relatively speaking, because French culture considered decent food a basic right even in wartime. So they received wine rations and relatively fresh bread when possible. But even when food arrived, eating it in the trenches was an ordeal. Everything tasted like the trenches smelled. Food was contaminated with dirt and worse. Soldiers ate while shells fell around them, never knowing if the next explosion would be their last meal. Hot food was rare because fires attracted enemy artillery, so most food was eaten cold. Water was heavily chlorinated to kill bacteria, giving it a chemical taste that made men gag. But you drank it anyway, because dehydration would kill you as surely as a bullet. Medical care in the trenches was primitive by modern standards, but represented significant advances in battlefield medicine. The trench system created a medical evacuation chain that would influence military medicine for the next century. When a soldier was wounded, he would first be treated at a regimental aid post just behind the front line, where a medical officer would provide basic first aid, stop bleeding, stabilize fractures, and administer morphine. If the wound was serious, he'd be evacuated to a dressing station further back, then to a casualty clearing station with surgical facilities, then finally to a base hospital. The challenge was getting wounded men from the front line to the aid post. Stretcher bearers had to carry casualties through trenches barely wide enough for one person, or across open ground under fire. A wounded man might lie in no man's land for hours or days before he could be retrieved. Many died not from their wounds but from exposure, dehydration, or blood loss while waiting for rescue. The bravery of stretcher bearers and medical personnel cannot be overstated. They went into the worst fighting, unarmed, to retrieve the wounded, and many were killed doing so. Doctors and nurses dealt with injuries that would haunt them forever. The high-velocity bullets and shrapnel from modern weapons created horrific wounds. Men would arrive with limbs hanging by threads of tissue, abdomens torn open with intestines exposed, faces destroyed beyond recognition. Gas victims would arrive choking, drowning in their own fluids, skin blistered and peeling. The doctors did what they could, but in the early years, infection killed many who survived their initial wounds. Antibiotics didn't exist yet. Antiseptic techniques were still being developed. Gangrene was common. Doctors would smell a wound and know immediately if it was infected. The distinctive, sweet, rotten smell meant the tissue was dying and amputation was probably necessary. The surgeons became skilled at amputations by necessity. They performed hundreds, thousands of them. Legs, arms, hands, feet. They developed techniques to save as much of the limb as possible, creating stumps that could eventually be fitted with prosthetics. But prosthetics in 1915 were crude, uncomfortable, and barely functional. A man who lost his legs in the trenches faced a lifetime as a cripple, dependent on others, often in constant pain. Many wished they had died instead. Facial injuries were particularly tragic. High-velocity bullets and shrapnel would destroy faces, taking away jaws, noses, eyes. These men, if they survived, faced not just disability, but social ostracism. They were horrifying to look at, and many spent the rest of their lives in isolation, unable to bear the stares and reactions of others. Pioneering plastic surgeons like Harold Gillies did remarkable work reconstructing faces, developing techniques that are still used today. But even the best reconstruction couldn't fully restore what had been lost. Shell shock cases presented doctors with something they didn't understand. Men would arrive unable to speak, shake uncontrollably, have seizures, or be completely unresponsive. No physical injury could be found. Initially, many doctors believed these men were faking, trying to escape the war. Some were court-martialed and shot for cowardice. But gradually, doctors realized this was a genuine medical condition caused by the psychological trauma of warfare. Treatment options were limited. Some doctors tried rest and quiet. Others used controversial techniques like electric shock therapy, administering painful shocks to force men to respond. A few pioneered what we'd now recognize as talk therapy, letting men discuss their experiences and process their trauma. But mostly, once men recovered enough to function, they were sent back to the trenches, where they often broke down again. The experience of wounded soldiers being evacuated from the front provided a glimpse of the war's true scale. Casualty clearing stations behind the lines looked like butcher shops during major offensives. Hundreds of wounded men would arrive simultaneously. Surgeons worked for days without sleep, triaging, deciding who could be saved and who was beyond help. The floors ran with blood. The screaming was constant. Nurses, many of them volunteers from wealthy families who had never seen violence or suffering before, worked tirelessly in conditions that would break most people. Many suffered their own psychological trauma from what they witnessed. Hospital trains and ships transported the wounded further from the front. British wounded crossed the English Channel to hospitals in Britain. French wounded went to Paris and other cities. German wounded traveled to hospitals across Germany. These journeys were agonizing for seriously wounded men, every movement causing pain, but at least they were moving away from the fighting. Many felt guilty for feeling relieved, guilty for leaving their comrades behind, but relief nonetheless. The impact on the home front was devastating. Every family lived in fear of the telegram that announced a loved one had been killed or wounded. Entire communities were traumatized. In Britain, so many men were killed that the impact on the population pyramid was visible for generations. France suffered even worse proportionally. Germany was bled white. And for what? By 1917, after 3 years of slaughter, the front lines had barely moved. Neither side was winning. Both were losing. The entry of the United States into the war in April 1917 changed the strategic calculation, but didn't immediately change the tactical situation. American troops arrived with enthusiasm and confidence, certain that their fresh energy would break the stalemate. They were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and had to learn the same lessons British and French troops had learned through years of suffering. American commanders initially resisted French and British advice about trench warfare tactics, believing that American fighting spirit would overcome obstacles that had stopped European armies. They were wrong. American troops suffered terribly in their early engagements, learning through bloodshed that courage alone couldn't defeat machine guns and artillery. But American industrial might made a difference. The flood of supplies, weapons, and fresh troops tipped the balance. Germany, already exhausted, facing starvation from the British blockade, and dealing with revolution at home, couldn't match this new infusion of Allied strength. The end, when it finally came in November 1918, came quickly. The German spring offensive had failed. Allied counterattacks were succeeding. The German army was collapsing. Mutinies broke out. The government fell, and on November 11th, the armistice went into effect. The silence must have been deafening. For 4 years, the Western Front had roared with continuous gunfire, explosions, and screaming. Then, at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, it stopped. Soldiers on both sides stood in their trenches, stunned, not quite believing the war was over. Some cried, some cheered, some just sat down, too exhausted emotionally and physically to react. In no man's land, between the trenches, the dead still lay where they had fallen, a final testament to the war's futility. The butcher's bill was almost incomprehensible. 10 million soldiers dead, 20 million wounded, 4 empires destroyed, an entire generation traumatized or killed. Britain lost nearly 1 million men. France lost over 1.5 million. Germany lost 2 million. Russia lost millions more, though exact figures are impossible because the Russian Civil War immediately followed the World War. Austria-Hungary ceased to exist as a nation. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. The map of Europe was redrawn, and the trenches themselves, they remained, at least for a while, long scars across the landscape, monuments to horror. Some have been preserved as memorials. Most were filled in, ploughed under, built over, but they haven't been forgotten. Farmers in France and Belgium still plough up bones, shells, and equipment a century later. The soil itself is toxic from chemicals and explosives. Areas of the old Western Front remain too dangerous to enter because of unexploded ordnance. The impact on military thinking was profound and permanent. Every major military in the world studied trench warfare, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how to avoid repeating it. The lesson they learned, or thought they learned, was that static warfare was to be avoided at all costs. Future wars must be mobile. This led directly to the development of armored warfare doctrine. The blitzkrieg tactics Germany would use in World War II, and the continued emphasis on mobile warfare that persists in military doctrine today. The machine gun had proven that massed infantry attacks were obsolete. The tank had shown that defenses could be breached. Aircraft, which had started the war as reconnaissance tools, had evolved into fighters and bombers, opening up a new dimension of warfare. Combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air power became the new standard. The generals who had sent men to die in futile charges were discredited. A new generation of military thinkers emerged, determined never to repeat the mistakes of the Great War. But here's the tragic irony. Just 20 years after the trenches of World War I fell silent, the world went to war again. And while World War II was more mobile, more mechanized, it was also more total and more deadly. The Eastern Front saw trench warfare return in places, particularly during the siege of Leningrad and the Battle of Stalingrad. The lessons of World War I hadn't prevented another catastrophic war. They had simply changed how that war was fought. Trench warfare appears throughout subsequent conflicts, though never again on the scale of World War I. The Korean War saw trench systems in its later stages. Vietnam had fire-based defense systems that were conceptually similar. The Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s featured trench warfare that would have been familiar to veterans of the Somme. Even today, in conflicts like the war in Ukraine, we see trenches, barbed wire, artillery duels, and the difficulty of offensive operations against prepared defenses. The fundamental problem that created trench warfare, that modern weapons favor defense over offense, hasn't gone away. Technology has changed, but the tactical challenge remains. The cultural impact of trench warfare extended far beyond military doctrine. The generation that survived the trenches was permanently marked by the experience. They called themselves the Lost Generation. Writers like Eric Maria Remarque, Robert Graves, Siegfried Sassoon, and Wilfred Owen tried to capture the horror in words. Their works, All Quiet on the Western Front, Goodbye to All That and Others, remain powerful testimonies to the experience. Owen's poetry, written in the trenches and found after his death, days before the armistice, captures the pity of war better than any history book. The survivors struggled to reintegrate into civilian society. How do you explain trench warfare to someone who wasn't there? How do you describe the smell, the fear, the exhaustion, the casual proximity to death? Many veterans simply didn't talk about it. They locked the memories away and tried to move on. But the trauma remained, surfacing in nightmares, anxiety, depression, and sometimes violence. Alcoholism was common among veterans. So was suicide. The war had broken something inside many of them that could never be fully repaired. Families dealt with the loss of fathers, sons, brothers. Entire communities mourned. Memorials were erected in every town and village across Europe. Lists of names, often dozens or hundreds from small communities, a permanent record of loss. The memorials at the Somme and Verdun display tens of thousands of names, soldiers whose bodies were never recovered or identified. The Meningate in Ypres lists over 54,000 names. These numbers are so large they become abstract, but each name represents a person, someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father, someone's husband. A life cut short, potential never realized, futures never lived. The political consequences of trench warfare and World War I more broadly shaped the 20th century in ways we're still dealing with. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, born partly from the suffering and anger of the war, created conditions for the rise of fascism in Germany. The collapse of empires created power vacuums and new nations with unstable borders. The Russian Revolution, partly triggered by Russian failures in the war, led to the Soviet Union and decades of Cold War. The Middle Eastern borders drawn by Britain and France after the Ottoman collapse continue to cause conflict today. In a very real sense, we're still living with the consequences of decisions made during and immediately after the trench warfare of World War I. There's also a technological legacy. World War I accelerated development in numerous fields. Medicine advanced rapidly. Blood transfusion techniques were perfected. Plastic surgery was revolutionized. Psychological understanding of trauma improved. Industrially, mass production techniques were refined. Chemically, new compounds were developed. Even something as mundane as the wristwatch became popular because soldiers needed to synchronize attacks and couldn't fumble with pockets. Watches in trenches. The war also changed society's relationship with military service and glory. Before World War I, war was often romanticized. Military service was honorable. Dying for your country was glorious. After the trenches, that romance died. People understood that modern war was industrial slaughter, not glorious combat. This skepticism about military glory persisted through much of the 20th century, though it has waxed and waned over the decades. Women's roles in society changed significantly. With men at the front, women took over jobs traditionally held by men. They worked in factories, drove ambulances, served as nurses, ran farms and businesses. When men returned from the war, many women were reluctant to return to purely domestic roles. The suffrage movement gained momentum, partly because denying women the vote became harder to justify when they had contributed so much to the war effort. Social hierarchies loosened. The old aristocratic order, already weakening, was further undermined by the war's leveling effect. In the trenches, Class distinctions mattered less than competence and courage. But let's return to the trenches themselves one final time, to really understand what made them so historically significant. Trench warfare wasn't just a military tactic, it was a symbol of modernity's dark side. The 19th century had seen incredible technological progress. Railways, telegraphs, industrial production, scientific advancement. There was genuine optimism that technology would create a better world. Then came World War I and demonstrated that all that technology could be turned toward destruction. The same industrial processes that built cities could produce millions of shells. The same chemical knowledge that created fertilizers could create poison gas. The same organizational efficiency that ran railways could organize mass slaughter. This shattered a certain kind of innocence or naivety about progress. The 20th century would be marked by awareness that technological advancement doesn't automatically mean moral advancement, that we can be more sophisticated and more barbaric simultaneously. The trenches represented this perfectly. Sophisticated logistics, advanced weapons, complex organizational systems, all devoted to the most primitive purpose imaginable, killing the enemy. Modern means, ancient ends. The trench system also represented a kind of stalemate in warfare that was unprecedented. Previous wars had stalemates, yes, but not like this. Not millions of men facing each other for years, unable to advance or retreat, locked in a death grip. The very sophistication of the defensive systems made breakthrough impossible with the technology and tactics available. This created a unique kind of frustration and futility. Everyone knew the situation was absurd. Everyone knew the attacks were futile, but no one knew how to break the deadlock except to keep attacking, keep killing, until one side collapsed from exhaustion. This futility created its own psychological weight. In previous wars, soldiers could believe their individual actions mattered. A brave cavalry charge could turn a battle, a well-defended position could save an army. But in the trenches, individual action meant almost nothing. You were a cog in a vast machine. Your death wouldn't change the war's outcome. Your survival was mostly luck. This reduced soldiers to something less than human, at least in how they were used by military planners. They became statistics, units on a map, resources to be expended. The dehumanization was necessary for generals to order attacks they knew would kill thousands. You can't think of soldiers as individuals, as people with families and dreams, and still order them to their deaths day after day. Yet paradoxically, soldiers themselves retained their humanity in the trenches. They found ways to maintain their dignity, their sense of self, through humor, through ritual, through the bonds they formed with each other. They celebrated small comforts, a dry dugout, hot food, mail from home, a quiet day. They found beauty in unlikely places, a sunrise over no man's land, flowers blooming in spring despite the devastation. They wrote poetry and letters and songs. They carved elaborate decorations into shell casings. They took photographs, preserved in albums that descendants would find decades later. They insisted on remaining human even in conditions designed to destroy humanity. This resistance to dehumanization is perhaps the most important lesson from trench warfare. The system was designed to reduce men to expendable units. The soldiers refused to accept that reduction. Their stories, preserved in letters, diaries, memoirs, and oral histories, insist on the importance of individual experience, even in the midst of industrial slaughter. Every one of those millions of casualties was a person, had a name, had a life, had people who loved them. The numbers are so large they numb us, but each number was someone real. And this brings us to why trench warfare changed modern battle forever. It wasn't just the specific tactics, though those were influential. It wasn't just the weapons, though they were transformative. It was the demonstration that modern war could be so destructive, so consuming, so total, that it would devour entire societies. That technological advancement had created a form of warfare that nations couldn't win. They could only survive. That the next war couldn't be fought this way, because no society could endure it again. This realization shaped military thinking for the rest of the century. The emphasis on mobility, on avoiding stalemate, on achieving quick, decisive victories rather than grinding attrition, all stems from the lessons of the trenches. The development of nuclear weapons was partly driven by the desire to make war so terrible it would never happen again. Though that's a different discussion. The point is, military planners looked at World War I and said, "Never again. We cannot fight that way again," and shaped their doctrines accordingly. But there's a deeper lesson too. Trench warfare demonstrated the danger of institutional momentum. The British, French, and German armies kept attacking in essentially the same way for 4 years, despite overwhelming evidence that it wasn't working. They knew the attacks were futile. They knew they were wasting lives. But they didn't know what else to do. And they had to do something. So they kept attacking. This pattern, continuing a failed strategy because changing course is too difficult or admitting failure too painful, recurs throughout history. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. Different contexts, same pattern. The trenches are a warning about the danger of institutional inertia. They're also a reminder of the gap between those who make decisions and those who suffer their consequences. Generals were rarely in danger. They lived in chateaux miles behind the lines. They studied maps and moved pins representing units of thousands of men. They ordered attacks from comfortable offices. Meanwhile, soldiers lived in mud and filth and terror, and died in their tens of thousands implementing strategies that clearly weren't working. This disconnect between leadership and those they lead isn't unique to World War I, but it was particularly stark there. One final thought. The trenches of World War I have become a metaphor for stalemate, for futility, for suffering without purpose. When we talk about being stuck in a trench, we mean trapped in a bad situation with no clear way out. The image is powerful because it's so vivid. The actual trenches are mostly gone now, but they remain in cultural memory as a symbol of war's horror and waste. Veterans of World War I are all dead now. The last one passed away in 2012. We've lost the direct connection to that experience. But the lessons remain. The warning remains. Modern warfare is so terrible, so destructive, that it must be avoided if at all possible. And when it cannot be avoided, it must be fought in ways that minimize human cost. These lessons, purchased with millions of lives in muddy trenches across France and Belgium, must not be forgotten. The trenches changed warfare not just through tactical innovations, but through stark demonstration of modern war's human cost. They forced a reckoning with what industrial society could inflict upon itself. They showed that technological progress without moral wisdom leads to catastrophe. And they proved that human beings, even in the worst conditions imaginable, can retain dignity, courage, and compassion. That's the legacy of trench warfare. Not just changed tactics or new weapon systems, but a fundamental shift in how we understand war, how we think about military service, and how we weigh the costs of conflict. Every memorial to the fallen, every preserved section of trench, every poem written by soldier poets reminds us that war is not glorious. It is necessary sometimes perhaps, but never glorious. Those muddy ditches, filled with suffering and death, taught that lesson more effectively than any sermon or philosophy text ever could. The men who fought in those trenches, who suffered and died there, left us this warning. Their sacrifice demands we remember not just their bravery, but their suffering, not just their willingness to fight, but the terrible price they paid. The trenches of World War I changed modern battle forever, because they changed how we think about battle itself. They stripped away the romance and revealed the reality. And that truth, however painful, is their greatest gift to us. A warning written in blood and mud, a lesson we must never forget.